I'll go ahead and put one more time the link to the workshop handout in the chat for folks to access. Lots of resources available on that. And we'll go ahead. So welcome to our workshop today, Decoding Information Literacy Learning Bottlenecks. This is the first workshop for the fall series of our library's Information Literacy, Virtual Information Literacy Workshop series. So I'm really excited to see everyone here today. And we'll go ahead and start moving forward. Before we jump in, I wanted to take a minute to just check in and see how everyone is doing today. I am super excited because this is our first workshop of the series. We'd love to hear how you are doing. So if you wanted to go ahead and just post in the chat how you are feeling today, I've given you all some options. And you can just post a letter, you can post the word. And of course, if these don't fit with how you're feeling today, feel free to add additional words. And if you don't want to share, that is fine as well. So we're seeing a lot of H's. So a lot of folks that are hungry out there, completely understandable at this time of day. A lot of folks are very busy, which is also very understandable at this time of year. So yep, a few folks have added T for tired. Again, also really understandable at this time of year. Oh, we have a bodacious. Oh, that's awesome. So thank you all for sharing how you all are doing today. And one more quick little activity before we jump into the content. I thought it might be fun to get us started. Make sure everyone's woken up just to do a little quick TV trivia. So I've shared some famous phrases from TV shows. And if you know what TV show this phrase is associated with, please go ahead and add it to the chat. So the first one, A, is Picture It, Sicily, 1922. B is Saving People, Hunting Things, The Family Business. C is Treat Yourself. And D is Ya Basic. So if you know any of those, go ahead and post those into the chat. All right, so we're getting some responses here. So A as the Golden Girls. So yes, Sarah, you are correct. A is the Golden Girls. We have B. Several folks have said that B is Supernatural. So yes, Sarah, Jennifer, you are right on that one there. So we have Stephanie has C as Parks and Rec. And yep, you are definitely correct on that one as well. And let's see, Brianne has B as The Good Place. And so, yep, you are right there as well. So excellent. So we know our famous TV catchphrases. There are those responses if folks were interested in those. You also now have a little bit insight into my psyche of what TV shows I like, in case you all were interested in that. So for anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Jane Hammonds, and I'm an assistant professor in the university libraries. I am the teaching and learning engagement librarian. My email is hammonds.73@osu.edu. If you do have any questions, comments, concerns, anything that you would like to discuss after the workshop, please feel free to go ahead and email me. I am always super excited to talk about information literacy and pedagogy. So I love to hear from folks after the workshop, so please go ahead and feel free to email me with anything that you have afterwards. So what are we doing here today? We're going to talk a little bit about this Decoding the Disciplines model, which some folks may be familiar with, but some folks may not. And we'll look at what this is, especially in relation to information literacy, and how we can identify the challenges that students may be having related to information literacy, and what kinds of activities or things that we can do to help students start overcoming some of those challenges. So as we're going through today, I do ask that you make sure that you're muted, but you can have your camera on or off. That is up to you. Any questions or comments you have, please go ahead and post them on the chat. I will monitor the chat and pause several times for questions and comments, so please go ahead and add those in there. So we will be using the chat. We will also be doing a poll today. Please feel free to participate if you feel that you can at this time. If it's not something you're interested in participating in, that is fine as well, no expectations. And I know that folks often like to know whether or not they're going to be expected to breakout rooms. So you'll be happy to know that there are going to be no breakout rooms today. So it doesn't matter if your hair is all crazy. Go ahead and keep your camera off and you're good. So I'll go ahead and share one more time the link to the handout for today. If you wanted to go ahead and access that and download that, that has tons and tons of resources on there. It's probably a little too many. I got so excited as I was putting it together. I ended up, it's like 5 pages long as you look at it. So you'll see that there's a lot of stuff available there. And don't feel the need that you have to take a bunch of notes. So I am going to share the recording afterwards, and I will also share all of the links and everything. So if you miss anything, again, you can ask in the chat, but also know that I'll be sending all of those things available to you all afterwards as well. All right. So we're going to jump in and we're going to do a quick poll. So hopefully I'll be able to go ahead and launch this poll. So I'm going to pop that up, and you all should now be seeing the poll questions. The first one is, are you familiar with the Decoding the Disciplines model? And the second one is, are you familiar with the framework for information literacy for higher education? So we'll give everyone a few seconds to answer those questions. So we'll give it 10 more seconds in case anyone wants to participate. Check our time. Okay, so we've got majority of participants have completed the poll. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results with everyone. So hopefully you all should now be able to see the poll results. If you can't, just go ahead and let me know. So are you familiar with the Decoding the Disciplines model? We have a small number of people who are pretty familiar or somewhat familiar with the model, but it does look like the majority of folks are not really familiar with the model, which is great. And then, are you familiar with the framework for information literacy for higher education? Slightly higher number of folks that are familiar with that one, but we also have some folks that aren't really familiar with that at all as well. So thanks for sharing. It's always helpful for me to know what folks are familiar with, so I don't go into too much detail on things that people already know about. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and close that poll. And then we'll go ahead and jump in talking about decoding the disciplines. So this is a model that was developed by Joan Middendorf and David Pace. And to get an idea of what we're talking about when we think about decoding the disciplines, we have a very quick thought activity. This is not something that you have to do anything for. You can share your responses in the chat if you would like, but you don't have to. But basically, think about the following questions. What does it mean to do research? Or what types of information sources are considered authoritative? Or what is the appropriate method of attribution? Right? Think about those questions in the context of your discipline or your area of expertise, and think about how difficult it would be for you to answer those questions. And for many of us, I think it's probably would not be too difficult, right? We know what attribution method is expected in our field. We know what kinds of sources tend to be cited in our field. But if you had to answer those same questions in a different discipline, would it be as easy? And probably not. You would probably have some idea of what an authoritative source looks like, but would you know the specifics of what kinds of sources tend to be cited? Would you know that citation style? Would you be familiar with using it? Would you really understand the practices of research in a different discipline? Probably you would be less familiar, less able to answer those questions really quickly. And that's really what we get at when we talk about decoding the disciplines, right? So the idea with this is that, as we become more experienced in our field, we gain a lot of disciplinary knowledge. We learn how people in our field think. We learn how they approach problems. We learn, oh, it just got dark in here for some reason. We learn, how people in our field perceive things or think about things. And so we have this disciplinary knowledge, disciplinary understandings. And a lot of this becomes really automatic for us. It's things that we don't even think about anymore. And maybe we didn't even consciously learn, but something that we've just picked up as we've become more expert in our field. And so what Decoding the Disciplines tries to do is recognize that disciplinary knowledge can contribute to the misunderstandings or the frustrations that we have between our expectations for students' performance and how students actually perform. We're coming at it from a disciplinary perspective of having these understandings, but that students may not have those same understandings. They don't have that experience in the discipline. And so what Decoding the Disciplines model tries to do is to bring those things to the surface, bring that disciplinary knowledge that is hidden to the surface, and think about how it's impacting our expectations for student performance, how it's impacting what we are teaching, the instructions that we're giving students for things. Are we skipping steps because they're really familiar to us and we didn't even think to tell students that this is what they need to do? We just kind of assuming that they know. So what the decoding is trying to do is to identify what those areas are and have this model for how we can bring those to the surface and help students practice with those ways of thinking or ways of practicing or ways of acting. So it is a 7-step model. I'm going to briefly go through the different steps. It's important to point out that you don't necessarily have to do all of these steps all of the time. And as we're going through and I start talking about some examples later on, we're really only going to focus on the first few steps. But I did want to do a quick overview of the entire model. So before I jump in, go forward, do we have any questions about the basic sort of concept of decoding the disciplines? And again, you can go ahead and post those in the chat if you would like. So we'll give it just 30 seconds just to see if there are any questions before we move on and look at the different steps in the model. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on, but if any questions do pop up, please feel free to go ahead and add those into the chat. So the first step in the model is to just identify the learning bottleneck. And basically what we're talking about here is, where are the places within your course that students constantly get stuck, or what are the tasks that over and over again you see that students struggle with, right? Where they are not able to meet your expectations. So where are those places that they are getting stuck? And I think it's important to point out here that bottlenecks can be either cognitive or emotional. So it could be, steps that students don't understand, but it could also be their emotions, their feelings about the course or the content that may be creating a block for them and making it difficult to move on in the learning process. So that's that first step of thinking about where are the places that students are struggling, where are they getting stuck? So after you've sort of started that process, and you might initially come up with a very broad thing, students struggle with citing sources, but then you have to kind of jump in and continue to think more specifically about what it is that they might struggle with. And so that's where you move through the next process of thinking about, what are the mental steps or the tasks? How do experts think about this, or how do they do this? What are the steps that they take? What is the knowledge that they're drawing on? What are the assumptions that they are making? And this can be really challenging, again, because as I mentioned, some of these things have become so ingrained in us that we don't even realize that we have this knowledge or that we're relying on this knowledge. And so we don't realize that when we're telling students to do something, we're skipping steps because it's automatic for us to take that step. And so you have to really continue to ask yourself questions. So an example could be something like, the bottleneck is that students struggle to locate scholarly sources. And you say, well, I told them to, go use a database to find the scholarly articles. And what database should they use? Well, they should use this database in my field. Well, how would they know that they're supposed to use that specific database? For you, it might be automatic that, yes, of course, this is the database that's used in my field. But how would students know that? And are you telling them that? So just kind of continuing to ask yourself questions and going through that whole, how would they know this? How would they be able to do this? So once you've gone through that and you've identified, okay, here are the really specific things that are giving them problems. Here are the steps that they're missing. Here's the understanding that they don't have. Then you can think about, okay, how can I model this for students? So that's that next step in the process is showing them, what to do, or showing them how you are thinking, performing the kinds of thinking that you want students to replicate, showing them, modeling it for them so that they can see how you would approach that problem or that task as an expert in the field. The fourth step is then to give them a lot of time to practice. And because a lot of these things are very complex, sometimes they need multiple opportunities to practice. This is where those low stakes assignments, very few points, can be really helpful, especially if you really clarify for students why they're doing that. Because sometimes we know that students can think of things as, busy work. But if you explain, we're practicing this and we're practicing this because we need to learn how to do this, it can be really helpful for them, for their understanding of why you're asking them to do that. Right. So that's step 4, give practice and feedback. And then they have step 5, motivate and lessen resistance, but they do indicate Middendorf and Pace that this kind of really is throughout the whole model, trying to identify what are the emotional bottlenecks that students might be experiencing? Are they really understanding why they have to do this? Or how might their preconceptions about the course or the subject area be impacting their willingness to do something? An example I give with this is my background previously was in history, and I would go into history classes and I would tell students, there's not going to be any multiple choice test in this class. There's not going to be any, fill in the blank test or anything like that that relies on memory. This is not how I approach the teaching of history. And for a lot of students, that would be very different from their understanding of what a history class should be. Their thought was they would sit there and listen to a lecture, they would memorize some facts, and they would, regurgitate those facts back. And so some students would get very resistant when, it wasn't that what they were expecting a history class to be. So if you could identify areas where students' expectations might be creating resistance to what you were doing and explicitly kind of address what those are. And then steps 6 and 7 are to assess whether or not students are meeting your expectations, and then share what you have learned from the process with students and with others as part of this process of thinking and decoding our own disciplinary thinking. So that is a quick overview of decoding the disciplines. So I'm going to pause there again and let everyone have a chance to think through that. All of those steps are on the handout for today. And so you'll see there as well a link to the Decoding the Disciplines site that has a really great overview of the whole model. So if you want to learn more about that, that's available on the handout. So we'll pause there and see if there are any questions or comments related to the decoding model. Give it 30 seconds or so, and then we'll move on. So Nicholas shared, it seems similar to a challenge I have in defining innovation in other fields. Peer-reviewed bench clinical research papers are the standard in pharmacy research, but other disciplines' primary research looks more like the scholarship, reviews, commentaries in my field. Yes, exactly, Nicholas. Things like that. So thinking about, what are the standard types of or formats of information? What are the ways that scholarship is shared in our field? What counts as primary research in the field? It's going to be very different depending on the discipline. And we may be using terms with students and not defining those terms clearly. So in this field, this is what this means. Absolutely. I think one of the hardest ones is just defining what research means in each field. That's going to be so different in a lot of different fields. And so a research paper could look very different for students. So we'll go ahead and move on and jump into the information literacy part of this, and then we'll kind of bring these back together. But again, please feel free to go ahead and post any questions or comments that come up as we are going through. So how does decoding the discipline connect information literacy? See if I can actually move forward. Before we start to look at that specifically, I did want to take just a second to define what I am talking about when I talk about information literacy. There's been a lot of definitions of information literacy over the years, and primarily they've been based around this idea of information literacy is about finding, evaluating, and using information. And that is still very relevant and very, that is what information literacy is about. But in recent years, the Association of College and Research Libraries has developed a broader definition, an expanded definition of information literacy that's published in a document called the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. And this really takes a conceptual view of information literacy. That information literacy is not just about skills, but it's also about ways of thinking, ways of knowing, habits that experienced researchers have. And it's developing these understandings of how information is created, how it is accessed, how it is shared, so how it is valued. So these broad sort of conceptual understandings that are necessary to be able to make use of the skills, right? So what do you have to understand about information, about scholarship, about research to really be effective? And so this is the perspective of information literacy that I use, that it's not just about skills, but it's also about understandings and ways of thinking and habits that experienced researchers have, and how we can help students develop that. So you might be thinking at this point, information literacy is not a discipline. So how can we apply decoding the disciplines to information literacy? And there actually have been some folks who have made arguments that information literacy should be considered a discipline. But we're not really going to go into that right now. But even if we don't think about information literacy as a discipline, I think most of us could agree that although there are these very specific, the specific disciplinary knowledge, there are also some common understandings that are generally shared among experienced researchers. So sort of common academic research practices, understandings about the purpose or the process of research and scholarship very broadly that are shared among experienced researchers. The value that we have for peer-reviewed sources goes across multiple disciplines. And so what we want to do when we think about information literacy in the context of decoding the discipline is think about what are some of the shared understandings or practices or habits that experienced researchers have that may be impacting our expectations for student performance. So what the Framework for Information Literacy tries to do is to actually identify some of these shared understandings. What are the big concepts, the habits that experienced researchers have that impact, what we expect from students when it comes to their performance on research or inquiry-based assignments. So I have a link for the framework for information literacy. It's on your handout as well. You can take a look at that. I'm going to just briefly go through some of the main concepts here. So what the framework does is they identify 6 core concepts that they think drives a lot of our expectations and our practices as experienced researchers. A couple that I really want to highlight in particular, one is this idea of research as inquiry. And what we're meaning when we talk about this is this idea that most experienced researchers in the academic context, we think about research as an inquiry-driven process, right? We're asking research questions, and we're trying to answer those questions through our work. And we recognize this as part of a shared process among practitioners or scholars in our discipline to extend knowledge in our field. So we're not doing this only for personal learning. And we don't think about research as a process of just compiling existing information on a topic, but we see this as this inquiry-driven process where we're trying to answer questions, we're drawing on previous scholarship, and we're presenting our arguments, our findings, and seeing this as part of this broader process. So the scholarly conversation, that second core concept, we recognize that our work is part of this broader conversation that has been taking place in our discipline, on our topic, on our research question, and we're just one voice. We're putting our findings out there, but other folks are going to be reviewing and looking at our findings, and we've been building on the work of others, and then others will build on our work, and so we see this as this ongoing conversation, right? And both of these concepts, I think, are really key as broadly shared understandings among experienced researchers that sort of drive our expectations, but that students may not be familiar with. Students may come in thinking of research as the goal of research is to compile information on a topic and summarize that information, and not think that, oh, I'm expected to add my own voice in here. I'm expected to do analysis and then share what I think, bring my own voice in. And so if we have that expectation, but students have a very different understanding of research, that's where we can have those frustrations with research assignments. So those are 2 that I think are key sort of core concepts. The other concepts that they outline, searching as strategic exploration, basically this indicates that we know that there's a lot of different search tools and search strategies that we can use. So experienced researchers think very critically about how they go about searching for information, about where they search. They know that they may need to change their search based on their initial results or the context that they are searching, that they can't use the same search tool or search strategy every single time they're searching. Authority is constructed and contextual, right? So we recognize that some sources are considered more authoritative than others, that there's a lot of factors that go into what makes a source authoritative. And we also recognize that context can determine what is considered authoritative, right? So we know that in certain disciplines or communities of learning, some types of sources or some types of information is going to be considered more authoritative than other types of information. Information creation as a process. We know that there's a lot of different processes by which information is created. We know it comes in a variety of different formats. We understand the capabilities of different formats, the constraints of different formats, and we know that the process and the format can impact how that source is viewed or valued. And then the last core concept, information has value. Recognize that information has a variety of different types of value, which may be financial, but maybe other types of value as well. And because it is valuable, there are rules and guidelines and regulations about how information can be accessed and shared. So those are the 6 core concepts. And again, what they're trying to get at with those concepts is what are the key ways of thinking or perceiving, understanding that experienced researchers tend to share that students may be less familiar with. So I'll go ahead again and I'll pause there before we kind of really try to bring these two together for the last couple parts of the workshop and see if we have any questions or comments that folks would like to share. On the handout, if you had a chance to look at that, and I'll try to put the link for that in there one more time if I can. I do have descriptions of each of those 6 core concepts, so you can go ahead and take a look at those, and the link to the framework should be available as well if you want to look a little bit more in depth into those concepts. I just gave a really quick overview of how I see them, but there are longer descriptions for each of those core concepts that are available. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions, so we'll go ahead and then try to bring these together and think about how we could use this decoding process to identify information literacy related learning bottlenecks that students might be experiencing. All right. So to get us started with this, I'd like everyone to take 30 seconds or a minute and just think about the ways in which students have tended to struggle to meet your expectations when it comes to research or inquiry-based assignments. Are there things that over and over again you see students not really being able to do or having trouble with? And if you want to share those in the chat, you can feel free. If not, that's okay as well. But just try to identify, to get it started, sort of an initial bottleneck that you think that you see in your students. And if you don't really have, if you're not really in a teaching position at this moment, you can also think about this in terms of maybe a bottleneck that you experienced as a researcher, something where you just really didn't understand why you were expected to do something, or later on it kind of made sense to you, oh, that's what I was supposed to be doing. So again, we'll let everyone think about that for just a few seconds. Please feel free to share if you'd like, and then we'll kind of move on through this process, and you can keep that bottleneck in mind as we go through and think about what this might look like. So Brian shared settling for the first semi-relevant sources that they find, or just one source. Yes. And Nicholas shared going beyond reporting conclusions to elaborating results in the research literature. Thank you. Jean shared bias within some search engines as a bottleneck. Elizabeth shared not knowing when to cite sources. Stephanie shared initial bottleneck is actually finding the research, but once we get past that, reading strategies for research articles is a challenge that can have different solutions for everyone. Yes, absolutely. Reading research articles and learning how to do that, it can be very challenging. Corey shared using familiar search strategies, what they've done in previous courses or disciplines. Yes, there's actually some research out there showing, that once students learn how to use that one database, they're going to use that database no matter what their topic is, no matter what the subject is. That's the one that they know how to use. That's the strategy that they know how to use. Angela shared language barriers for reading articles in students' second language. Yeah, definitely challenging. So thank you all for sharing those. And again, you can keep that bottleneck in mind as we go through and kind of look at what this process might look like. And feel free to share others as they come into your minds. So the first part of the process, again, is identifying that bottleneck. So that's what we've been trying to do. Think about those places in that course where students struggle to meet our expectations, or we see them making the same mistakes over and over again. And so someone had mentioned in the chat, citing sources. This, I think, obviously can be a huge challenge for students. And when I was thinking about this as a bottleneck, what I really started to think about this is, I think oftentimes this is an emotional bottleneck for students as much as it is a cognitive bottleneck. I think students have a lot of emotions around the citation process. I've had students do create like PowerPoints showing their feelings on emotions, and they have really strong feelings about citations. So they might have anxiety because they've been told over and over again, if you don't cite your sources correctly, you're going to get in trouble. It's plagiarism, you're stealing, right? So this punitive perspective that we often have with citing sources, students may not understand why there's such emphasis on citation, or why is it that I have to change my citation style with every class that I have. So I think that there can definitely be some cognitive bias problems with citing sources, just not really understanding how the formats work. But I wanted to focus on this as an emotional bottleneck, the anxiety or the feelings that students might have about the source citation process. So once we've identified our bottleneck, our next step in the process is to understand the mental tasks or the shared understandings, excuse me, that might be driving our expectations. So some questions that we could ask ourselves at this point is, how do we as experienced researchers think about citations? What do we think about citations? What do we understand about the role that citations play in the research process? So if you have responses to those, you can share those in the chat. 1 second, sorry. But thinking of yourself as, as someone who's an experienced researcher who uses citations a lot, what do you think about citations? What are your emotions towards citations? And thinking about what are the core concepts from the framework that might help to explain sort of how we approach thinking about citation. So as I was going through and thinking about these questions, sorry. How do I use citations? How do I think about citations? A few things that came to mind for me. One was this idea of information has value. And as someone who's an experienced researcher, I recognize the value of citations to me as a researcher and to me as an author, right? I know that it gives value to me when someone else cites my work. And so, if my work is not being cited, then, someone has used my work but hasn't cited it correctly, I feel like my voice has been silenced. They've taken something from me that was my work. I recognize the value of citations to me and being able to use citations to engage with the scholarly conversation. Right, so I know that I can, if I find one good source on my question or my topic, I can usually use the citations in that source to find a whole bunch of other research on my topic, right? And so, I use the Google Scholars cite it by all the time, and I'll have, I find one article and suddenly now I've got 20 articles that are open as I keep opening the citations up. And so I see the value of citations as part of this sort of ongoing process of sharing scholarship and discussing scholarship among experts and other peers. Do students really have these same understandings? So I think that these may be places where my understanding and the way I think about citations is very different than how students might think about citations. If they don't really think about scholarship as conversation and they've never used citations to find other citations, they may not see that value. So what I could do at this point is then say, I'm going to actually talk to the students about how I approach citations. I'm going to talk to them about this concept of the scholarly conversation. I'm going to talk to them about the value of citations as part of this ongoing academic research process. So I'm going to change the approach in how I talk about citations from one, that's if you don't cite, you're going to get in trouble, to let's talk about why it's important to cite sources, and what value it brings to you as a student, what value it brings to you as a researcher, what value it is to the scholars that you are citing, their work. So kind of model that way of thinking for the students. And then give them time to think about and practice what that might look like. So the image on the screen you'll see is an example, just a screenshot of an article in which the citations have been blacked out. And this could be an activity where you give students something like this and say, what are we losing by not being able to see those citations? What are we missing? And we can talk about, you can't go back and check anything that's been said because you don't know where it came from, right? So helping them to kind of try to develop that different mindset, the different way of approaching citations. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about how you can use this decoding model to sort of work through bottlenecks that you might be seeing related to information literacy, and thinking about what are some of the core understandings that might be driving the way that you're seeing this that may be different from how students are approaching the same task. And then step 5, so motivate, lessen resistance. So again, talk to them about the preconceptions or the misconceptions they might have about the purpose of citations, and clarifying, being very clear in my own expectations. Here's what I'm doing, here's what I expect from you in terms of citations. So that's going through, and I'm not going to go through the next steps for that one, but I just wanted to share an example of how you could go through that model to start breaking down an information literacy learning bottleneck. Another example, there's a great article by Joan Middendorf and Andrea Baer, Bottlenecks of Information Literacy, where they go through a bottleneck related to this concept of research as inquiry, and look at this idea that students may think of research as just about source retrieval, right? Rather than, I need to actually use these sources to answer a question. It's really just about, I'm going to get the right number of sources, and that's what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to think about how those sources might contribute to being able to answer my research question. So this is a great article if anyone wants additional guidance on how to go through this process, and thinking about helping students to develop an understanding of research as a process of inquiry rather than as just source retrieval. All right. Check the timing here. Just a few different bottlenecks that I wanted to highlight, ones that folks might be familiar with. I've already mentioned this before, but just understanding expectations for research assignments, I think, can be a real challenge, especially related to this idea of research as inquiry and this idea of scholarship as conversation. If students don't have those understandings, some of the things that we expect them to do in terms of research assignments may not make much sense to them, because they have a very different perspective on what the purpose of research is. Selecting a search tool. This can be a challenge for a lot of students. They, again, may not recognize the difference between different types of search tools. One database is as good as another, so they don't know what's considered authoritative in their particular discipline, or generally in higher education, what kind of search tools are considered authoritative, and they may not recognize how they need to vary their search process based on the context. Selecting authoritative sources, that this can be a real challenge. Students may not recognize what an authoritative source is in that field or in academic research more generally. Oftentimes they can't really even distinguish between different types of sources. As we all know, the lines between types of sources have gotten kind of blurred, especially since we find everything online now. We don't actually see print copies of anything. So it's really hard, I think, and a lot of times for students to really see the differences between types of sources that would allow them to identify authoritative information. And then reviewing the literature. Students may not, again, understand why they need to do this if they don't have this understanding of scholarship as this ongoing conversation, and that they're building on the previous conversation that has been taking place. So those are a few understandings, example bottlenecks that I've seen, and thinking about how you could use this process to work through what those bottlenecks are. So if you wanted to go back and think about the bottleneck that you initially identified, and give you some time just to think about what are some of the sort of shared tacit understandings that may be influencing your expectations. And I have some examples on the handout, and you have the framework concepts there. So I'll give everyone just a few seconds to think through that if they want to. Again, feel free to share responses in the chat, but you don't have to. No, we're running out of time, as I always do at the end. So we'll pause here for a second, just let everyone think through that. And then we'll move on to our final section. So I'll go ahead and move on. As you're working through, if you do, afterwards, if you have identified a bottleneck and you wanted to think through more about the concepts that may be related to that, please go ahead and email me, and I'm happy to talk through that process with you as you can think about, how you might be able to overcome that bottleneck. But we'll go ahead and look at, for this last part here, what are some activities that we might be able to use? And basically the activities are going to be broken into two types. The first type are going to be activities that you might be able to use to identify bottlenecks. Because one of the things is, of course, as we become more experienced and more expert, we may not even see exactly what it is that's causing students trouble, or exactly what the misconceptions that they have might be. So we're going to do some activities that you could use that will help you to identify, oh, here's what they're thinking about this process or this task. And then there'll also be just some activities where I've picked a specific bottleneck and tried to give an activity that you could use to kind of address that bottleneck. But I have tons and tons of sample activities. So if none of these work for you and you're looking for an activity related to a specific bottleneck that you're seeing, please go ahead and email me, and we're happy to talk more about that. So I'd like to do a quick activity as a group. So this is just a quick true/false activity about authoritative information. So I have 4 statements here. And I would like you, if you're willing, to go ahead and post into the chat which ones you consider to be true. So the 4 statements are: A, a source on a .org website is usually credible. B, all sources located through library databases are scholarly sources. C, all sources found on a university website are scholarly sources. And D, if a source has references, it is usually credible. So if you wanted to go ahead and post on the chat all of those that you think are credible or think are true, or if you don't think any of them are true, that is fine as well. You just post none of the above. And we'll give folks a few seconds to respond to those. So we have some responses here. So someone has posted that D is true. Someone has posted that A is true. Then we have a lot of folks that are thinking that none of them are true. None seems to be the most common response, but sometimes they're credible or true. Maybe B is true. So I think the most common response from folks was that none of them are true, or true always, I would think. And so that would basically be my response as well, that none of them are completely true. I think, for D, for example, if a source has references, it may be more credible if a source has references, but you can also have those sources, where the references they cite are all back to the same person that wrote the article, or all back to the same organization that posted the website. So they're posting references, but they're not really engaging with the broad conversation. They're posting references to themselves or to their own sources. So all sources that are found on a scholarly or university website or scholarly sources. C, I would not consider that to be true. B, all sources located through a library database are scholarly sources. I would not consider that to be true, since that you can find newspaper articles or magazine articles in library databases as well, and they would not technically be considered scholarly sources if we go with a very strict definition of scholarly sources. And then A, a source on a .org website is usually credible. I don't really consider that one true. There's a lot of .org sources out there that are not. It's really an open domain. Anyone can actually post there. So the point is not to actually jump into all of these, but just to get an idea. This is an activity that you could use that would help you get to some of the ways that students are thinking, right? So, you find a lot of students say, yes, C is completely true. Then you can talk about, okay, let's talk about what kinds of sources you usually find on a university website and what scholarly sources actually look like. So this is just a very quick example of the kind of activity that I like to do that really helps to identify misconceptions that students might have, or things that they're just not quite sure about. And sometimes there are things that they haven't really thought of themselves. And if you ask them, here's the statement, they may have take some time to work through, well, I haven't really thought about whether or not that's true or not. So true false activities, very simple, but I have found them to be incredibly helpful in the past in identifying, oh, here's what students are thinking. And so if you're interested in doing something like that, I have example true false activities for all of the different concepts in the framework that you can go through and use those to get started with an activity that you could use with students. Another example of a quick activity that you could do would be some sort of reflection and response activity, sort of like a short writing assignment. So, just ask students, what is the purpose of research? And then have them share their responses. You could also use a video. I have videos on all the different framework concepts and research concepts, and you could say, here's how this video describes what research is about. How does that compare with the writing that you had about what research is? Or have them say, what do you think it means to say scholarship as conversation? Some of them may be able to come up with some definition. Some might not be sure at all what that means. Have them watch a video and then go back and think about, now that you've seen that video, how would you describe this idea of scholarship as conversation? So these are really short activities, but very helpful, I think, in just sort of getting an idea of what students are thinking. Another example of this are self-explaining activities. So just having students explain how they are approaching doing something. You want them to find scholarly articles, have them talk you through the process of how they go about identifying what scholarly articles are. And as they're talking, they're going to have to think themselves about what they think, and they're going to share it with you, and you can hear where they may be going wrong, right? And help to, put them back on the right direction. So anytime where you're having them explain what they're doing and why, so that you can hear that, I think can be really helpful for identifying those bottlenecks. For a couple examples for specific bottlenecks, one bottleneck might be identifying appropriate sources in the particular discipline. So you could do some activity, for example, where you give them an article, a typical article in your discipline, and have them go through and annotate the citations. and say, in yellow are all the scholarly journal articles, and pink are all the book chapters, C are white papers, whatever kinds of sources are used in your field, and have them get an idea as they're annotating that bibliography. Oh, look, 90% of these citations are for scholarly articles, and 5% are for white papers or whatever type of sources that are using, so that they can start to see and visualize how types of sources that researchers tend to use in the field. Another example, I've done this activity several times. If the challenge is they're not using the right search tool for their information need or the type of information that they need, one of the things you could do is an activity where you give them a note card with here's your information need, and you have a note card with here's the type of search tool or resource that you have. Do these match? Right? And if students need information on an event that happens last week, but their resource is a peer-reviewed journal article, you can talk about, does that really connect? And if not, what type of search tool would they want to use? So we're kind of having them swap around cards until they get match the search tool with the information need. So there are a few examples of different kinds of activities that you can do. If you want to think more about specific concepts and the bottlenecks that students might have, one of the great things is the framework provides knowledge, practices, and dispositions. So like actions or ways of thinking that students need to develop to understand that concept. And those can often be very helpful for identifying those bottlenecks. And my final recommendation as an activity is one directed at you. Taking some time, there's some great questions. I have them on the handout that are based on an article by Sarah Miller, where she guides you through the process of identifying the disciplinary knowledge that you have. So thinking about who the authorities are in your field, what information formats tend to be used in your field. And those questions are on that handout. Taking some time to do that, you'll realize all of the disciplinary knowledge that you have, and how you can start to think about how that might be influencing your expectations for student performance. Right. So we're coming to the end. If you have some way that you are planning to apply or use any of the things that we talked about today, please go ahead and post that in the chat. I would love to hear more about that. And additional learning opportunities, I will share all of these again, an email with everyone, but we have bunches of different workshops coming up on all different information literacy related topics. So I'll share all of the links to those. Please feel free to register for any that you find that are interesting. And then I just have some resources and references there. So I'll go ahead and again, please go ahead if there's anything that you can share about how you might apply this, go ahead and post that in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing. Any questions, comments, thoughts that folks have? We have like 1 more minute, and of course I can stay longer as well. So I'll stop talking now and open it up to questions or comments. Thank you, Brianne. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks, everyone. It was great to see you all. Yes, have a great day, everyone. Wonderful. Thanks, Jen. Hi, Rocky. How are you?
Doing well. This was very informative. Oops, I'm getting an echo here.
Oh.
I was wondering, is there what would be your first good source for decoding the disciplines?
There's a website, it's decodingthedisciplines.org. And that goes through kind of a broad overview of the whole process and has each of the steps laid out. So I think that's a really helpful introduction. And then there is, let's see if I can do the sort of an article that sort of started it all is listed in that handout. It is, see if I can find it really quickly somewhere. Thought I had it on there. Looks like it did not save. I can send that article link to you. I thought I put it on the handout, but it's not. Let me email Rocky. That kind of outlines the whole process.
Yeah, because I see where it looks like it might be helpful for even training. You know, behind the scenes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I definitely think it could be.
I'm not just teaching, but like with cataloging and some other stuff.
Yeah, I think there's probably, a lot of practitioner knowledge that someone might have that, oh, everyone's going to understand when I say this. And then, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, this was very helpful. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Bye.
Bye.